Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Q&A with the director of Patient No More, Diana Fraser. Diana, thank you so much for joining us here at the Twin Cities Film Fest and sharing your art.
Thank you for having me. I'm really proud to be here.
Well, we are proud to have you. You're a proud Minnesotan. You do wonderful work over at TBT and different places. We're going to learn a little bit more about that, but tell us a little bit about why this story was important for you to tell.
So before I got into film, I was a really big public health nerd, and I went through like all of the pre-med programs that you could possibly think of in high school. And I volunteered at the hospital, and I thought I was going to be in medicine. And then I fell in love with film and oops, went a different direction. But once I got into public television, this story just sat there with me. I wanted to talk about women's public health. We don't talk about women's public health very well or very often. And often when we do, it's in this state of jurisdiction over a body. Mm-hmm. And so there was something calling me to that for a long time. And then I started to pitch this women's public health series, but there was always this queer women's health element that was a part of that. And I was like, I think I want that one. I don't want to pitch that to other people. I want to make this. And so blessedly, after a long grant cycle, as most indie filmmakers are familiar with, the Minnesota State Arts Board gifted us $10,000, and we were able to actually make this film. Mm-hmm. So it was a long road and pretty common, I think, on the indie storytelling front, but it had always been really important to me. And I had kind of felt called to tell this story, and I was really honored to be able to actually bring it to life in the end.
And as part of that calling, wasn't it from your own experience when you connected with a caregiver or a medical professional that really saw you for who you were?
Yeah, I came out when I was 18 in rural America, which is a very different place than a lot of other spaces, especially the spaces I get to orbit in the Twin Cities now. And I was really scared. She was an Argentinian Catholic, which, by stereotype, didn't seem like it was going to go very well. And she was one of the first people to really affirm me. Mm-hmm. And she made this great switch immediately. She was like, oh, I'm sorry, what gender pronouns should we use? What type of partners do you have? She shifted immediately into gender neutral language and just made the appointment about me and the care that I needed to be safe and well and healthy. And that is an experience I wish everyone could have, because after that, you get really protective of having to open yourself up over and over again, right, to new care providers. You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to go through the whole story again.
Right. And so when kind of coming out over and over and over again.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just this never-ending escalator. And when I got to the Twin Cities, I had to seek medical care again because this provider was back where I had grown up. And I really avoided it for a long time. And it turned out that a lot of my friends in the queer community were also avoiding it because they didn't know what were safe spaces, or if all safe spaces were really actually safe, Mm-hmm. And at the time, right, it was just after marriage equality had been passed across the country. Mm-hmm. This was still pretty fresh and pretty new in terms of societal jargon and dialogue. And so it was still a conversation that was being had very privately, and kind of in that underground network kind of way. And that was one of the reasons, honestly, that making the film became more and more important, because it was this is information that I, as a youth, desperately needed, right? And it turns out my friends still need this.
Completely.
And if we do, and we're pretty well connected in the activism circles and stuff like that, that means there's a lot of people out there who need to understand our issues more, and also need to understand that there are people who are in the world who can care for them and care for them appropriately and with respect to who they are.
With your physician, you kind of wonder, and maybe as you worked with her, was it just her natural being that brought her to that understanding? Or do you feel, because again, part of the question is do we need a bunch of LGBTQ doctors, or do we need to make sure that the message and sexual conversations are much broader than they should be?
I think in general, the education part and the practice part is really important. We do not have standard healthcare education for PAs, for nurses, for doctors, for anesthesiologists, like it's just not part of curriculum. And so LGBTQ healthcare is usually optional. It's usually on the side. It might be a lunch. It might be guest speakers. If you're queer, you might be like actively trying to make it part of your education, but it's really not a regular part. And so that is what makes it so cyclical and generational in terms of, right, like when you think about the medical field, it's super hierarchical, and it's always generational knowledge being passed down, as well as research improved upon, right? And if you don't have an infrastructural design to give a hoot about queer issues and queer health, and also you don't have people who are already familiar with what that looks like, it just becomes a perfect storm and nothing happens, right? And so I think it's a two-prong approach. One is that, yes, we always need more providers and support staff, right, who look like us and can relate to us in a personal way, because that's what makes care, I think, most sustainable and effective. But you also just need people to know what these issues are and what they look like and how to, frankly, care for all patients, as opposed to this very small subset of the world that we typically teach healthcare providers to inherently know how to deal with.
The other interesting thing for me is the idea that my understanding is that in healthcare, there are many, many more women working in healthcare than men. Is that still, when you take a look at all the support staff and all of that stuff, or as I'm privy to some of the residency programs where if they have 7 or 8 new residents, 5, 6 of them are women. So we hope that things will improve for all women and in particular queer women.
Yeah, I think generally, I honestly am not quite as up on the stats as I was when I was doing the actual making of the film. I think it is fair to say that there is definitely a better balance of both genders, as it were, in medical practice, probably less so of folks that don't fit the gender binary. But I think it's still fair to say that the majority of power in the medical field and medical, professorships and tenure and stuff like that, that is still pretty well owned and dominated by the male gender.
You had a wide variety of people that were involved in the film, and I especially enjoyed seeing you, former Representative Quaid, if that was correct. It must have been interesting to visit with notable people like her as well to put this together. So you had good support, correct?
I really did. I had been lucky I had worked for NARAL back in college, and their NARAL Pro-Choice Minnesota. And so I'd been kind of embedded in some of the more, I would say, like grassroots health movements in general, which was really, really helpful when it came time to make the film, right? Because you had people who knew people. And so I had actually tweeted at Erin McQuaid when this was just an idea, going like, you want to be in a documentary about queer women's health, just like shooting my shot and hoping that it landed. And she all along the way was super enthusiastic and really supportive, which was amazing and really, really great. And it, like, she was filming with us as she was doing campaigning stuff. Like, it was really, it was a lot of her time, and I really appreciated how in she was.
For some of our viewers that might not know much about putting together a documentary, give us just like a sort of a roadmap of, how many months of pre-production, production, post-production. Why are you laughing? Oh my gosh.
I feel like funding is always like the longest part of the process. Somehow I managed to get like all of the things to be the longest part of the process. But because I was doing this as a side gig, right, I kind of had to play the long game a little more. But so fundraising took probably about a year, because I lost one grant cycle, like just nothing came through, right, like usual. And then had to go for the second one. We shot a couple of interviews in the beginning and then went on hiatus as we were trying to figure out, like, okay, is this like a short film? Is this a long film? Like, is it feature film? Is it for broadcast? Like, what's our get here? And then once I had funding, I was able to reach out to other collaborators who I got to work with in my day job, who were willing to give their time and talent, bless them, to make it happen. And so once we got all of those things together, it was probably another 3 months of production. And then I was editing for about a year because I managed to get in a nasty car accident. And so I was sitting there editing with one hand for a while. But we finally got to release it in May of 2019.
You also, as you put together your production, you made a very strong point and very inclusive as you selected camera people and editing and stuff. Talk a little bit about that. You talked about percentage of your crew needed to be a certain. So how did you support the diversity of production?
Well, so obviously being part of the queer community, it means that like intersectionality is already a really common part of our dialogue. And it was really important when we looked at the film that this film was representative behind and in front of the camera. And so a couple of decisions were made from the get-go. One was that majority queer identified and female identified at the time of filming people were going to be the experts in this film, whether they were physicians or patients or what have you. And so we wanted those voices to be centered. I wanted to make sure that the film was by community, for community, and in community, right? So it is technically a Minnesota story. It is shot here. It's shot with people who have deep connections to Minnesota. Having said that, it's made so that it's pretty applicable in any state, frankly. Sure. That this issue doesn't localize here, right? It's all over the country.
It has a very, you talk about, look for people that look like you or whatever you could identify, there were a lot of variety of voices, diverse voices.
There are. And also, I think what I was really proud of in terms of how people have talked about the film to me afterwards is that there was always something someone could identify with somebody else's story, right? Whether you were of the same race or gender or class or sexuality. And I think that's what's really important, right? Is that we can all learn from each other in this space. And that is what I think deepens the work and deepens the connection. And then the last thing that I did was I wanted to make sure, because obviously in our industry, we're not great on the representation front in terms of our crews. I made a guarantee that at least 50%, it ended up being more, but at least 50% of our crew was going to be female, folks of color, or queer identified, or some mix therein, right?
Oh, sure.
And by doing that, what we ensured was people could feel safe, right? Because we're asking you to talk about really vulnerable parts of your career or your private experiences or your medical care. And you cannot do that if you're othered on camera. And obviously I don't share the same identity as everybody who is in that film, but I do fit under the queer umbrella and I do identify as a woman, and I have had some of those experiences. And that made it a little easier, I think, for me to kind of gauge across our crew members, many of whom, as I said, were really generous in donating their time. Were they a good fit for this production? And would they make sure that my guests felt safe?
What's next? What have you, what's Pigtail
Brigade Productions.
Pigtail Brigade. I tried to remember it in my head and I have to, that's you as a production company, kind of? Yeah.
Pigtail is mine. It comes from, I typically wear my hair in pigtails on set. Okay. When I was younger and on set, somebody mistook me for the PA, and the way I wear my hair has nothing to do with whether or not you
completely. Can oh my gosh.
And hot. So there's a little bit of an homage there to the early years. But hopefully what's next, I have a digital series that I'm pitching. We'll see where it goes, but about queer folks' experience with religion and faith and spirituality, because all three of those things are kind of different elements.
Oh, yes.
And historically, obviously, the queer community has had a very tepid relationship with the church and other religious institutions. But that doesn't mean, just because a religious institution rejects you does not mean that you reject your faith.
Oh, completely.
Or that it doesn't transform.
Some type of spirituality or
right.
Oh, yeah.
So I think there's a lot of really rich storytelling to be found in there. And I'm hoping that good funders will come forward and we'll be able to work on that next.
Well, you have given us some rich storytelling. We always talk about the idea of watching something and making us think and making us feel, opening our eyes, taking a look into a place where we maybe don't think about. And Patient No More definitely did it. So we are so pleased and so glad to have your film part of the festival, and that you took some time with me this evening to talk a little bit more about your film.
Absolutely. And thank you. We really couldn't, like, this is how we share it out in the world. We are indie filmmakers, but also I need to give a really big shout out to everybody who was on camera and behind the camera, because this is a labor of love and it does not happen without everybody else. So thank you. And thank you to you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody.